Hello and good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to Wizikey webinar. My name is Archit Mahajan, and I'm a PR manager at Wizikey. With me today, I have Shreya Ganguly, who's the Associate Vice President, Customer Strategy at Wizikey. And we both are going to be your hosts for today.
Thank you, Archit, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be a part of this session.
Thank you all of you again to join us at the Wizikey webinar, which is by far, I think all of you know, it's a by invite virtual session. It's actually humbling to note that I was just looking at the audiences, and our audience have actually joined us from different parts of the world. So welcome all of you again. I would just request you to keep yourself on mute through the sessions. We'll be conducting a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. And that's when you can unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can help us with the questions in the chat.
Yes. Thank you, Archit. I think before we delve into our session today, let me ask you a question. Do you think we've got people at a very odd hour today?
I think that's an interesting question, Shreya. I think so, but I also think we are eagerly waiting for Friday. So that keeps us going. At least it's definitely the Friday that keeps me going every day. I'm sure it's all for everyone's feeling the same way.
Absolutely. I think, with the threat of the third wave looming and, the extended working hours during work from home, we all are somewhere looking forward to a weekend and a Friday. And I think, but at the end of the day, it's all about having an interesting session today. And what we have for all of you today is something very exciting. And I'm sure it's going to be worth the while. I mean, worth the wait. And there are going to be two segments. The first segment is going to be about, a problem that PR professionals and comms professionals are battling on a day-to-day basis, such as it is about interesting metrics of PR measurement. In the second segment, we run with how to manage a global PR program in an insightful fireside chat with Ms. Irina Marciano. She is the Director of PR and Comms at Payoneer. To give you a brief about Payoneer as a brand, it is a commerce technology company that powers payments and growth for the new global economy. And they're doing some transformational work across cross-border payments. I'm very excited to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to this.
Absolutely. So am I, Shreya. But I think let's take it a little slow. Before we delve into our first segment and then eventually into the second segment, let's introduce Wizikey to our audience. I'm sure some of the audience members that we have joined us for the first time. So here's a slight introduction about Wizikey. Wizikey is actually one-stop shop solution to all the PR needs. I think we put it as simple as possible for you. It's actually one-stop solution for all your PR needs. It's funny, but we take pride in calling ourselves as Wizards because we are constantly using data-driven insights to actually solve that one sole objective, which everyone as a communications consultant or a professional faces in their day-to-day life, which is elevating the role of PR and communications as a critical business function. So I think without further ado, Shreya, let's just introduce all of our audience to I would say the core of all the magic that we do as Wizards, that is the Wizikey dashboards.
Absolutely, Chit. I'm very glad you brought up the entire Wizard conversation because I'm sure everybody's understood by now that we all are Potter fans, and every Potter fan has to have a place where they do their magic. At the core of their, entire being is magic. So this is where I would like to introduce the dashboard to you, a place where we all do magic and bring in the best data-driven insights to all brands across the world. Before we start, Archit, I think you've been in the PR industry for some time now, right? And what is the most difficult question that you're battling day in and day out?
I think on top of the mind, I can call, can I measure PR or can we measure PR? That's probably one of the questions that have been brought, I think, maximum number of times. And to be very honest, I think I've lost the count also, how many times that question have been asked to me.
Absolutely. I think every boardroom conversation, every time we are, presenting, we need to measure, right? And every other department in marketing has measurables. So why not PR? And it can't be as difficult as, people make it like it's as difficult as climbing Mount Everest, but it can't be that difficult, right? There has to be an easier way out, and there has to be an technology and data doing it for you. So what you see here, share of voice is the first chart. Of course, everybody understands, all of us here who are present understand share of voice. It is a very common marketing terminology. But what is different in this chart is there are 2 points which I would like to highlight. One is, when you collect share of voice, the process is pretty tedious and it's a very time-taking process. So speed and real time is what I would like to highlight here. What you see here is your news, your share of voice versus your competition on a real-time basis. If you click on these charts, these colorful, I must, congratulate our product team. They have done a wonderful job with the colors here. So when you click on these colors, I mean, these charts, these pies, you can see all your news out here. You can also go and see which are the publications or which are the reporters who have written about you and have mentioned you in their stories.
That's quite interesting, to be very honest. I think within a click of button, it's all this information is accessible. But on a different tangent altogether, as you were scrolling, Shreya, I could see something that intrigued me a little. I would say there was a reporter segment also, right? Next to news.
Yes,
Can
yes,
you
yes,
please
of
tell
course.
me and the audience, I would say, what exactly?
I think reporters, this is the pulse of what we do here at Wizikey, right? I mean, some people have even told me that, are you like being a bumble? You're being a bumble between a brand and a reporter, right? That's what we're trying to do eventually, probably. So what you see here, these scores, the 22, all these scores are called the engagement scores. How does it solve for PR professionals and comms professionals? When you are planning your exclusives, when you're planning your embargo conversations, you go by gut, right? You know that these 5-6 people are the people I will reach out to on a day-to-day basis because they know my brand. But what if we give you a score to decide that? Won't it become easier for you? For example, you know that 10 people are the final people I want to give out my embargoes to. You just open your engagement score, see the scores and decide, and it's all out there in terms of data. You do not have to go by gut anymore, because sometimes what happens is we are wrong when we go by gut. There may be some mistakes we do, but there is no chance or any opportunity to be mistaken here, because the data speaks, as they say, data speaks, right?
No, absolutely. I think to some extent it does make a job of a PR and a communications professional easier. Whether we are on a brand site or whether we are, we have consultants helping us. I think share of voice gives us one step ahead to measure the work that we are doing. But here's my question, okay? And this is something purely on the basis of understanding the share of voice more. While you've shown me the chart, right? I can obviously fiddle with the timelines and see what kind of share of voice did I gather in what month and stuff. But what if I need to find out my share of voice and my competition share of voice, let's say on a monthly basis as well as a weekly basis? Is it possible to get all within a click of a button?
Absolutely, Archit. I think I was coming to it. Good you asked this question, because these charts are very related to each other, right? You see the bar here, this shows you a snapshot of your performance on a week-to-week basis, on a month-to-month basis. And also we have this news volume trends, which show us which are the peaks in terms of news coverage that we've received versus our competition. You can again click here and find out, why was my competition doing better than me at a certain amount of time frame. And you can also do it here. You can select your news and see how, once this feature is launched, you can check how you've been performing in terms of your different parameters. But how does it help? That is the bigger question here. Data-driven PR and I think data-driven insights help you to, they give you an indication of your campaigns or your strategy ahead. They're actionable insights, because you action that, you basis them, you decide if you're, for example, if you see a dip in Feb and March, you would want to do something to increase it in March and April, right? That you would do. You would go back and check what are the trends and what are the different conversations that are happening. Where is your competition doing well? Is there some trend that they are tapping into, but you are kind of missing into? For example, there might be a bellwether of SaaS or for example, like a gold rush of fintech that they might be tapping into. Are you missing out on that? That is what this helps. And I think it increases productivity for all PR and comms professionals to a great extent.
I think it's very fascinating to hear some of the metrics that you just talked about, and some of them are very new to me also, because I have been a PR professional for a while now, and getting these metrics at just a click of a button, I think this is interesting. But the one, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to draw out one analogy, and I find it very interesting again, is how that's a popular saying, right? Keep your friends close, but also keep your, I wouldn't say enemies, but competition closer, right? So I'm targeting my competition every day, every month, every week to just see where and what do they have advantage on and how can I make myself better. So that speaks a lot. So I think sorted, but interestingly, for communications, right, spokesperson is the helm of, rather, I would say, communication for any brand, right? So what if I want to know there is a matrix which can probably give me an idea about how my spokesperson fared out with respect to his competition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that we all are striving to do every day, right? So if you see this chart here, the leadership share of voice, it helps us understand, where our leadership or a spokesperson is faring in terms of their quotes or their media coverage. Just to bring an analogy, I was having a conversation the other day with the founder of a leading, fintech company, right? And he told me that there's one word or one term that everybody understands today. I mean, even his customers, his investors, and also, for example, his even people who are merchants, right? So he was telling me thought leadership is that term. And how do I become a thought leader? That is going to be my focus for the next 6 months. So this is where you get to realize where you are. And this is the thought leadership metrics, I would say, in terms of how much, how many stories are you targeting on a week on week basis, on a month on month basis? And is your spokesperson, does he need to do more quotes? And for example, even on trending topics, in trending bellwether topics like budget, so even you and your competition both might have given out quotes, right? Has your quotes been received more, they have been received more frequently by media, or has your competition seen more of prominence in media? Those kind of things is what your leadership share of voice helps you with. And it also gives you an understanding, do you need to increase, which direction do you need to increase your efforts in? Is it going to be more of trend tapping? Is it going to be more of profiling stories? Or is it going to be more of, for example, standalone pieces that you need to do?
Understood. But I think this is pretty much clear, and I hope it's also pretty much clear to our audiences. But I'm going to tread into a different direction right now. Okay. So here's the catch. Everybody, or rather every brand, like to see themselves getting mentioned in the headline. Correct. So I'm just going to try my luck, as I say. But does Wizikey offer any metric that gives an idea that how can we track a brand that is mentioned in the headline?
Just the thing, we know what what comm professionals want. We just know it because we understand the pulse of professionals. And here you see this, right? This is exactly what solves the purpose. I mean, what are headline grabs? They are the showstopper of your PR and campaigns, your marketing efforts and your PR efforts. They are like the silver bullet. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about visibility. How many times are people seeing you there? And having yourself seen, having yourself in the headlines, I think it's the biggest boost for any comms professional or any brand professional. So while these charts, again, these are clickable at the click of a button, I keep repeating that, the click of a button, because it's so easy. That's the best part about it. So seamless and easy and doesn't take any time, right? So you see, you can go ahead and check where your competition is, times they are in the headlines, how many times you are in the headlines. And there's one more interesting feature here. We also have a proactive PR meter. So what does this mean? You might be getting a lot of stories during the year, but you would want to know and understand how many times you have been mentioned in the headlines during a particular year. For example, out of 1,000 stories you've generated, how many are headline grabs? This is where proactive PR meter helps you. You might want to do proactive stories. You might want to do recall-based stories. That's completely up to you as a brand. Every brand has different business objectives, right? So it completely depends on you how you want to, navigate your PR campaigns. But at the end of the day, headline does matter, and I think this gives you a very fair idea of where you're faring. There's one more interesting thing. I would like to take some time here, Ajit, and show you a very interesting feature, which is story weight. I think this is one of the best features, because at the end of the day, some brands, they ask me for industry pieces. Some brands, they ask me for standalone pieces, and some they want more of mentions, right? Depending on different people's business objectives, I think we have different different categories that we want to invest in. Here, if you are a brand which is focused on industry stories, you want to do more of category. I'll give you a very small example. Categories like crypto, categories like neobanking, they are very niche, right? And in India, at the moment, I think there is a need to develop the category more than doing stories also on their particular brand. So if they want to do more of category building stories, should they target more industry stories? Absolutely. This metrics give them an understanding of how much and which direction should they go in. Does that solve your, answer your question, Archit?
Yes, it does. It does. But I'm very inquisitive like that. And because you're showing me something which I wasn't very aware about. So I'm going to ask one more question here.
Sure.
While you're scrolling, right, I could see something on sentiment analysis. So
Yes.
what exactly is sentiment? I mean, I do have an idea, but I want to hear it from you. What exactly does it stand for?
Now you would agree, right? What is a PR professional's life without crisis or without any kind of understanding of where is the looming crisis, where is the red flag? So I think sentiment analysis is very important for us to understand, because it gives, we do this with the help of keywords. We have a data team which does it at the back end, and they use keywords, a lot of keywords and attribute mapping to understand which are the stories which have a positive sentiment for you versus which are the stories which are a negative sentiment. And this also gives you an indication of a looming crisis, perhaps a bigger crisis or a red flag that is, on the way, and you need to be aware of it from the beginning of time and prepare your statements or prepare your conversations accordingly. That is what this, sentiment balance helps us in. And I would say that this is one of the most key features that brands today desire. And I would like to thank the entire product team in terms of how they use AI, ML, and a lot of other technologies, innovative technologies, to get this kind of sentiment analysis for us, making our lives easier.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't agree more to you. I think just, I mean, the overall idea of sentiment analysis, right? It just opens up up a new level of conversations, right? I can track my crisis management skills, whether I'm a brand or I'm a consultant working for a brand. I know how how I was able to navigate through the crisis, or how well I need to do better for the next time, right? So I think it's fair to say there are a lot of metrics right now, and I'm sure I could see a lot more metrics up your sleeve in the segregation. So, which is probably something that is yet to come up. So, all in all, I would like to mention here that we started the conversation with not having something to define PR and the limits, right? But after hearing what Shreya had to, discuss with all of us, I think there are enough and more metrics that we see PR actually, helping PR and brand communication professionals every day. Rather, I think there is scope of much more metrics that are yet to come, and we will see that in future. So I was thoroughly intrigued by the entire scheme of things that Shreya presented today. And I hope you all were also intrigued. In case you want to know more, please do reach out at sales@Wizikey, and my team would be happy to give you something, or rather, I would say an interface with the dashboard, so that you can just fiddle with around your brands and also understand the depths or the insights that the data-driven PR or a SaaS-driven PR model brings to the table. So thank you, Shreya, for sharing those insights with us.
Absolutely.
And with this, I think it brings us to the end of the first segment. I personally think I can feel it in my guts that all of you have been waiting for this main event. Yeah, the main event being the fireside chat on how to run the global PR program. And we have a special guest in-house today. And I promise I won't make you any way longer and introduce our special guest to you. Hi, Irina.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. I would just like to introduce Irina, and then Irina would I would say, request you to take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience. So I'm very happy to introduce Irina to all of you. Irina Marciano is Director of PR and Communications at Payoneer, like Shreya mentioned. Personally, I've interacted with Irina on one or two occasions here and there. And Irina is an experienced B2B marketer and a PR specialist with, I would say, over a decade of experience. She is undoubtedly one of the most inspiring communication leaders, at least I have interacted with, or I would say I've had a good fortune of interacting with. So thank you again, Irina, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for those incredibly kind words. I'm really excited to chat with you guys, and the work that Wizikey has been doing for Payoneer has been so valuable and has really kind of given us a different perspective with the way we handle our PR in the region. So happy to be here and happy to share.
We are equally excited, Irina. Trust me on that. So, Irina, I think before getting into the nitty-gritties of how to run a global PR program successfully, I want to ask you something, or rather, I want to know something from you, right? And this is a personal opinion. I have seen a lot of people, saying that those who get into the PR and communication industry usually end up, into the PR and communication industry by accident. So, is PR and communication industry, I would say, a profession by accident? Honestly, I think I'm a live example. But I think your career graph is also on the similar, stature. So can you shed light upon how you forayed into the world of PR and communication? What were some of the problems? Did you actually face problems, and how were you able to solve them?
Sure, sure. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's almost nobody who ends up in PR and marketing on purpose. I think it's one of those things that you stumble into and realize you're kind of good at, and end up building a career there. So I also am an example of that. I started my career in theater and television, actually. I got my first degree in theatrical design, of all things. But I really loved everything to do with storytelling, with theater, with kind of the spectacle of it all, right? It's funny, I always remember I used to have this professor back when I did my first degree in theater, and he was like the stereotypical, like if you were doing a Hollywood movie about a theater professor, this was the guy you would cast. He was out there and just kind of very creative and all over the place. And he used to jump around the classroom and tell us, everything is theater. You know, you see animals swimming in the Pacific, that's theater. And we used to laugh and think he was crazy. But as time has passed, I've realized he's so right, because really so much of what we do in the world is about how you present yourself, how you tell the story, how you make the story relatable, and how to move people. And I think that that's really what PR comes down to. So I did start my career in entertainment. I eventually found my way to business and went back and got a business degree. And I very much started as a marketing generalist, really trying to figure out what I wanted to do and explore my way. And I kind of fell into some PR tasks and realized that I really had a strength and passion for it. And I loved being able to take, particularly in a B2B story, to take a complicated technical product or a technical issue and figure out a way to make it relatable and to make it memorable. And that's how I ended up here. Nobody starts here, but here we are.
No, I completely agree with you. So my question is, again, I think we're going to start some PR related questions and communication related questions so that our audience also grasp that knowledge pretty well. Because you are an industry stalwart, I want to understand what's the role, or how do you see the role of PR evolving over the time? And do you see its scope, I would say, growing at present and in the future?
Sure. So I think it's an important question, because I think the role of PR has shifted significantly, as has the role of marketing in general. And I think there's a couple of factors that are driving that shift. So first of all, the audience today is a lot more savvy when it comes to sales and marketing than they have been in the past. And there's a number of reasons why you can explain this, but I think for the most part, it has to do with the constant bombardment that all of us have with sales on different channels and, across different devices. And so the audience is much more savvy. And at the same time, they are much more resentful to being sold to. They understand when it's a sales pitch. How many times have we all been on a thread on some social media channel and seen people say something positive about a company, and then you have a million people accusing them of being shills and saying, oh, you must work for that company. So people are really watching out for that kind of thing. And the flip side of that is that while everyone is a savvier consumer, they are also a much more engaged consumer. So they are following their favorite brands across multiple channels. They're engaging with them in many ways. And so reputation has never been so important, right? I mean, you can believe in it or not believe in it, but you hear all this conversation around the cancel culture and the current generation being a lot faster to say, hey, this company doesn't align with my values, I'm not supporting them anymore. And then social media gives them a channel to broadcast that. So you have to really be aware of how you're running your PR, because you need to present an authentic version of the company, right? You don't want to be salesy. You don't want to be making a pitch. On the flip side, you have to be very careful about what you say and what you don't say. And you have to be aware that every slip up will echo across 1,000 channels and across 1 million users. So it's really, I think it's become a much more delicate line to walk of how do I tell the story of my company in a way that's going to be valuable to the listeners, right? Like, it's no longer about selling our company. I just want to present something of value. And then I hope that having presented something of value, our company name will stick in their minds and will create a positive sentiment. But I can no longer do the thing that I feel about 10, 15 years ago, we could be a little bit more direct with saying, and here's how Payoneer can solve your problems. You know, it just doesn't work that way anymore.
No, absolutely. I think we all agree with you. We see the scope of PR growing every day, which is why I think all of us have joined this PR, this webinar, and we really want to understand where is the next level going to be, right? So I'm going to shift some ball here and introduce something new, which is content has been always termed as the king, right? And nowadays people are saying, and especially a lot of people who are involved in the communications field are saying that storytelling is the queen, right? So as much as I have interacted with you, I know you are a master storyteller, right? So I want to understand, and I want our audience to also understand, how do you see storytelling growing as an important ingredient for the communications? And at Payoneer, how have you been ensuring that the element of storytelling is almost there in every communication that you put out?
Sure. It's a good question. I think actually that storytelling has always been a key ingredient of effective communication. But I think because of what we just talked about with the way that audience sentiment has shifted and the way that they view companies has shifted, it's become more important, and it's perhaps become the most important element. And people might ask kind of, what is storytelling, right? By the way, when we talk about storytelling and we talk about PR, one of the things that I focus on when we're training up spokespeople, and I'll talk about training in just a second, but one of the things I focus on is cut the buzzwords, right? Nobody wants to listen to a whole bunch of buzzwords. So storytelling is becoming a little bit of a buzzword. So let me define what I mean by that. You can no longer speak in theoretical and high level terms. Storytelling is about figuring out how the product or service you're talking about, what is the human element there, right? So as you mentioned at the beginning, Payoneer is a cross-border payments company at the core, right? Like if I had to say in 3 words, we do, that's it. But nobody really cares about that. Like there's no interesting thing to say about that. What's interesting are the lives that we change by helping people have access to the global economy, or by helping people expand their business. You know, what's fascinating are the people who have really been able to change their communities and their lives as a result of working with us. So it's finding those human elements and finding those stories. And that's what I think is so sure that is carried throughout the organization. I think a big part of that is training. So one of the things that I do for all our spokespeople, right? But actually what I do is I take part, I've been with Payoneer for a long time. I didn't really introduce myself in the company very well, so I'll do that now. I've been with Payoneer for about 5.5 years. And I didn't start out as just the PR, head of PR. I started out within one of our marketing departments. And then over time, my role grew and kind of shifted into what it is now. And so because of my kind of perspective in a more general marketing sense, one of the things that I do is help onboard new employees and give them an introduction to marketing and PR. And I offer for every new employee, and quite a few take me up on it, to do media training. And a lot of people think, you know, why would you be training your R&D person or your customer account manager on media training? And the reason is because storytelling needs to be part of every single person's mantra. It's how they should be communicating with every audience, whether that's an internal audience or an external audience. And so the thing that I tell people to walk away from the media training with is that you are always on. Whoever you are speaking to is recording a mental memory of what you're saying. And you want to make sure that you are presenting your story in a way that's memorable. And the way to do that is to follow everything you say with the words for example. The second you finish a sentence, you need to follow it up with for example. And if you don't have that for example, then you can pretty much assure yourself that whatever you said prior to that will not have been remembered or heard. So if you're talking about a product, if you're talking about whatever, the future trends, everything needs to have an example. And that example can be a story about a customer you've impacted. It can be a piece of data that was otherwise unknown. If nothing else, it can be an analogy, but you need to paint a picture. Using words is not enough. And I think that when you train the whole company to think in this way, down from people who don't necessarily interact with customers or journalists all the way through to your official spokespeople, you create a culture of people thinking about the products and the services in this way, of not, okay, how do we, help solve this technical glitch, but how do I fix a problem in my customer's life?
No, absolutely. I think that's a thing. I think humanizing the story mentioned is critical, but that was some of the interesting insights that you brought to the table. So thank you for that. Just a different perspective on, I would say, global PR, or how we say that. I want to understand, and for the audiences also, what's your viewpoint on global PR, or how everybody knows this as cross-border PR? Do you think that it is important for global brands to actually put this as a part of their strategic business plan?
I do, absolutely. You have to do it in a planned and smart way. You can't just take whatever press release you were going to put out in one country, translate it, put it out over the wire, and call it a day. Yeah. But I do think it's critical, right? And it's critical because of all of the things we talked about how audiences have changed and how consumers have changed. People need to connect to a brand. There are so many channels, and of course, social media and your website, and there's so many important ways to interact with people. And it's critical that the way that you're presented in external parties is reflective of your brand. So I do think that it's something that companies should plan for, but they should do so strategically. Mm-hmm. And when they're doing so, one of the things that and this is a moment of me kind of pulling in our new brand, which is all about universality, but I'll say it anyway, there's no universal approach to being universal, right? So you can't approach a global PR program as though it's a singular thing. It really is like, adding new chapters to a story every time you open a new geography, and you have to be local about it. I would say it is worse to start a PR program in a new country where you are unprepared to do so, or you don't have the right understanding of that geography. It's worse to do that than to start nothing at all. So you really have to make sure that you're doing it in a very planned way, and that you are prepared for what comes with opening a new geography in PR.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense, Irina. Thank you for that insight. You have been actually at the helm of managing the global PR mandate for Payoneer, right? Mm-hmm. for some time now. And we can definitely understand there are a lot of intricacies involved when it comes to, like you said, if you don't know about the local geography and you do not have the right partners, then it becomes altogether a mammoth task to manage everything together and stitch the right narratives, right? So can you share a few things with our audience today in terms of how a business should, or rather what a business should keep in mind before entering a new geography, especially from a PR standpoint? Sure,
absolutely. So let me start by talking about how Payoneer does this. And I think that it's a way that makes a lot of sense. We are a global company. We operate on a global level. And by that, I truly mean global, right? We're in over 190 countries. But that's not to say that our presence in every country is equivalent. In some countries, we have the capability of serving customers, and that's about it. And in other countries, we have hundreds of employees and much more people on the ground. And so when we think about starting a new PR program, and to put this into perspective for the audience, we have about 10 active PR programs around the world right now, which is to say 10 agencies working full-time on retainer. And then we have a handful of kind of one-off project countries. And the way that we determine whether it's a one-off country or a full-time PR agency country has to do with what we see as the maturity of the country. I should say the maturity of Payoneer's presence within the country. So the way that we enter any country, and particularly from a marketing perspective, is we start with identifying a brand ambassador. And this is usually a power user, one of our VIP customers who has already interacted with the brand quite a bit, already has a lot of influence in the community. And so we identify those individuals and we start working with them to see whether it makes sense for us to begin building out an on-the-ground presence. After we've had a bit of kind of this grassroots development of a country's community, at that point, we will begin hiring sales and customer support people. That's usually the first people we put on the ground. And if I have to pick between those two, it'll usually be a customer support person first, and then a salesperson. And the key is, and only once we've gotten to that point, when we have a salesperson, a customer support person, and either a brand ambassador or a country manager, only at that point would we even begin to think about starting a PR program. Once we do, we will find a partner willing to work with us on a temporary basis, on a 3-month project basis. I do think that 3 months is the minimal amount of time that you can kind of judge the effectiveness of a PR company. But we will work on this 3-month basis to not even see so much what the results are, because 3 months is probably too short to see really significant results, but more to see kind of how we work with the agency, whether they're responsive to our needs, whether they come to us with creative ideas. And then at the end of those 3 months, if we feel it's been a success, only then will we discuss launching a full-term program. And the reason that we do it that way, earlier on I said, you have to be careful not to be salesy, and it's true. And one of the biggest internal debates I have is trying to explain to people, particularly in the marketing and sales world, that PR is not really a lead generating activity. And I think there's a lot of people who get upset when they hear that, because as marketers, we want everything to be a lead generating activity, right? And your executives want ROI linked to everything, and it's critical, and I get it, but that's not what PR does. And if anybody is trying to convince you that PR is the best channel for lead generation, they are lying to you, because there is never a world in which you can say, oh, well, we put out an article and so we got 100,000 signups. Anyone who says that, they are incorrectly attributing those leads. Yes, it's true that it is a touch point, and it's a very critical touch point, but that's not the goal of PR. The goal of PR is to build a long-term brand and to affect audience sentiment and to build trust. But in order to do those things, in order to build trust and have a positive sentiment, what you need to ensure is that once that reader or that consumer does get to the point where they say, okay, I know this brand, I trust this brand, I think I'm ready to work with this brand, you need to be able to serve them. And if you don't have an in-country presence, and you are making a big splash in the country, and then you have users pouring to your website and it's not localized. And when I say localized, I don't mean translated, right? I mean, the messaging has been adjusted to fit the local culture and the local flavor. If those things haven't happened, then you are not prepared to enter that geography, because your customers will have a really bad experience. So I would say it's step one is building up that support network. And then step two is beginning to expand that message and build up the brand.
Understood. I think that gives all of us a fair idea on what are the things that we should be looking out when we are trying to expand our horizons of PRs, right? Another question I have related to, I think, Payoneer, and how, because Payoneer has been doing some transformational work, especially in the cross-border, PR segment. So 2021, I would say it's safe to assume that it's the year of IPOs, right? There have been enough and more industry reports which says that over 1,070, IPOs have been filed already in the Q1. Definitely, it's growing. We can always see that it's growing to be the next level in Q2 as well. Congratulations to you. Recently, Payoneer has also gone public, right? So here's an interesting question for you, Irina. While you were talking about cross-border payment, PR insert, how we should be delving into it and how should we be foraying into it, how do you see this function changing once the company is actually listed?
Yeah, so I'm still kind of figuring this out, to be totally transparent, right? So we went public at the end of June. We're about 2 months into it, and it's my first experience working for a public company from a PR perspective or from a marketing perspective, period. It's funny, leading up to us going public, we were working extremely hard because we were setting up this incredible days long celebration and this viral moment to create, which ended up being incredibly successful. We actually brought almost 2,000 of our employees together in both physical and virtual spaces to celebrate, along with thousands of our customers. It was really cool. But we had so much leading up to it, and I kept telling my friends and my colleagues, I just can't wait for us to finally go public and for things to slow down a little bit. And people kept kind of laughing and saying, I don't think that's what's going to happen. And I said, I know, but let me just pretend. And of course, that's so much not what happened. My job has continued to be so incredibly different today than it was 3 months ago, and much more challenging and much more interesting in many ways. And we're still figuring it out as we go along. But one of the things that has become incredibly, let me back up. There's kind of two main things that have changed within my role as PR as the company has moved towards going public, and now that it actually has gone public. The first is the less fun thing, but let's talk about the less fun thing, bureaucracy, right? So our company is kind of well known for the amount of autonomy that we give employees, and we really try to let people have their own space and be their own experts. But when you are dealing with regulatory compliance and all of the legalities that come with going public, there is a mountain of new red tape that needs to pop up. Every comment that you make about the company has to pass through legal now, and it has to pass not only through your legal, but in our case, because we went public via a special purpose acquisition company, or SPAC, it has to go through the SPAC's legal as well. And it has to go through your investor relations team, and it has to, and so on and so on. So lead time has shifted tremendously. And I've gone from being very, very good about getting people things, a week or two in advance, and having my teams kind of prepped around the world, to having to tell our teams, including, you guys with Wizikey, I'm sorry, I'm getting this to you right now. It's going public tomorrow, and it's just because that's how long approvals are taking now. So that's kind of the negative. The positive, although it's also a challenge, but to me, it's a fascinating challenge, is how critical crisis management has become. So the great thing about being a public company from a PR perspective is that the attention is on you. The bad thing about being a public company is that the attention is on you, right? And I made the joke that the week we went public, it was the fastest I've ever gone from saying, hey, we're on the news, to, oh no, we're on the news. The story shifts very quickly when you're in the public eye. So what has become critical is organization and planning in advance. And so anytime we have a news story that we know might be coming out that might not be positive, or might just have potential to be fun in a negative way, and I'll bring up an example of this in just a second. Anytime we have that, we now do things like plan extensive FAQs in advance, get those out to all the leadership across our company, even leadership that generally does not interact with media in any way, to ensure that they're prepared and know what the steps to do are if they're, contacted on any channel by a journalist or a company. So it's a lot of that kind of preparation, and it's also around thinking through all the possible scenarios that are going to come up in advance, and being strategic about saying, okay, we know we might have a bit of challenging news coming out. Let's plan to have a couple of positive announcements at the same time. And say, and this is still something that I'm very much figuring out, and actually if you guys heard a chime from my computer, it was a reminder that I have a meeting coming up to discuss the guidelines of this, quiet periods. Quiet periods are, of course, something that become very critical once you go public. You have the space of time that could be anything from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, from when the quarter ends to when earnings are released, that you're not allowed to signal anything about the value of your company to the market. And that begs the question, well, what signals value, right? So if I'm putting out a report that has data about the growth of my customers, couldn't someone extrapolate that to signal the value of how the company is doing? You know, if I'm making a big announcement about a new partner, that signals value, that signals that we're seeing revenues change. And so all of those things cannot be done during the quiet period. And if you have 6 weeks of quiet period every quarter, that's a quarter of the year that you cannot make major announcements. So how do you get creative about making sure your company doesn't just disappear from the public eye, you know, for a quarter of the year? And these are the things that we're still working through. And it's about really making sure that you have a variety of stories and a variety of content in your arsenal, so that you have times of the year that you put out these value building stories and times of the year that you have more evergreen customer success type stories. I had another point. It's gone from my head. It's very early in the morning for me. So I will leave it there. And if it comes back, I'll bring it up again.
Well, thank you so much, Irina. I think the points that you brought to the table are extremely valuable to us. In fact, I think people, or rather brands that are preparing for IPO, should also look out for those points, especially, like you said, well preparation, or rather prior preparation is something that everyone should strive for, right? So with this, I think I have one last question, and it revolves around our favorite topic, which is about how technology is influencing the field of PR and communications,
Sure.
right? Coming from a company that has been listed on stock market, right? It has already expanded its PR horizon into different geographies, right? And I'm sure there are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of management challenges. There are a lot of processes that are coming on board, right? You're managing different agencies, your partners, different stakeholders internally and externally, to get everything to get every information and make sense out of it, right? So
Yeah.
do you see technology helping you in that space? We have, I would just like to add that we have been partners to Payoneer for a while now. And if there's anything that you think technology has solved for you, I would request you to bring this to light. Sure.
Yeah. Nowadays, we're all able to say technology doesn't solve some problem, right? Technology is solving and creating most of our problems today. Yeah, you know, metrics and measurement in PR is probably the biggest challenge. And it's a challenge that I have not seen anybody solve completely, but we are chipping away at it. And actually, you know, you brought up that we've been working together for 2 years, and it's you guys have really brought a new and unique perspective to how technology can rate PR. And I want to talk about some of those ways. The challenge with PR comes back to what I was talking about earlier, that you can't say somebody saw an article and therefore they clicked the link and became a customer. It is not that direct. It's a touch point though. And so traditionally, and most of the agencies we work with around the world do it this way. When you ask about measurement with PR, people just say, okay, let's talk about the number of mentions, which then is extrapolated into share of voice. And that's not valuable. It's valuable, okay? You do want to know how many times your name appears in the press, and you can sort of deduce from that, okay, well, you know, if our name is appearing in the press more than our competitors, it's likely that our target audience is going to have heard of us and have a more positive sentiment. It's likely, but it's not like we're grasping at straws a little bit there, because also, let's say one of your competitors had a massive scandal that month and had lost millions of customers. That's, you know, people say there's no such thing as bad PR. That's nonsense. There is absolutely such a thing as bad PR. And so if your competitor is in the news a million times because of bad PR, I wouldn't say, oh, well, they have a 90% share of voice this month, they must be doing well. So you need to be looking at your PR program a lot more critically than just how many times as I mentioned. And also the problem with just tracking mentions is that that's a reactive, that's the last step of the process. You know, you can stare at it and say, why haven't we been getting mentions this month? But if you're not looking at what you were doing to lead up to that, how are you going to make any deductions? And so that's what I think Wizikey does very well and really has a unique perspective on, is you guys are tracking not just what were the results, but how did we get there? So at every week when we have our weekly meetings, you're telling me, here are the campaigns we did, here's the open rate for the journalists, and here are which journalists engaged the most, and here's how our open rate changed from last month. Here's the open rate for this campaign versus this campaign. And what's really interesting about that, first of all, PR people as a whole are not used to thinking as more lead generation marketers in terms of A/B testing and taking a more scientific approach. That's fascinating to know. When we use the word COVID, for example, we had this discussion last year. When we use the word COVID in the headline, peak of COVID, journalists not open emails. They were overloaded with COVID news, and they didn't want to think about it anymore. And so we realized, okay, yeah, it's an on-trend topic, but we need to mention it, build it into the context of it, but not have the whole pitch be about that. And so we were able to deduce from that kind of tracking, hey, this is not how we should be approaching our pitches. I remember there was another time you were taking me through the previous year's results and what we should be thinking about for next year. And you were doing a keyword analysis with what are your competitors focused on. And we found that a keyword that was totally missing from our lexicon, that our competitors were leaning on and that journalists were responding to, was the word exporter. And it's funny because, of course, the customers we work with are exporters. That's what they do. They ship goods or services across just that terminology in-house, because it's more of a connotation of like mass goods, and we work with more sellers and brands. So we always talked about cross-border sales or e-sellers or freelancers, and we never used this word exporters. And it turns out that's what the audience related to. And we just didn't know that without doing that kind of analysis. So I do think that being able to track kind of not the results, but how you got there is critical. And what I've been trying to do, and this is, I think, critical for a global PR program, is try to take those learnings from across geographies and test them out in different markets. But you have to be willing to understand, again, that the results of one country are not going to be equivalent to the results of another country. And the COVID example I brought up is perfect, because at the same time that the Indian journalists we were reaching out to were completely overloaded with COVID and didn't want to talk about it anymore, the journalists we were working with China, they were very much kind of in a post-COVID phase. And they wanted to know what was going on with international companies and how different countries around the world were faring. And so the political situation changes across countries. The cultural situation is different all the time across countries. Different topics resonate, and you need to. That's why it's so critical to have a local team, and that's why it's so critical to be tracking, which campaigns are doing well and which campaigns are doing well on a global level, and being able to understand. Just because there's this really exciting bit of news I want to talk about in the US, that doesn't mean it's relevant for our audience, in the Philippines. And so understanding that and tracking that, I think, is critical.
Thank you for that insights, Irina. I think what we also believe in at Wizikey is that technology and rather data are both a deadly combination, and they are going to change game. And in fact, they are changing game for the entire PR and communication landscape. So with this, I think my questions are over, and I would open the floor to the audience. So everyone, please feel free to ask Irina the questions that you have. You can either unmute yourself, or you can give us your questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to read out to Irina. Actually, I already have one question with me. So I would like to, this is pretty big, but I'd like to read that question to you, Irina. The question is pretty simple. How do you get customers to speak about your product in terms of when you're talking about storytelling, right? There needs to be some information, or rather experiences from the local customers that you service, right? But usually we have seen that companies often struggle to get that input from the customers, or are they shy away from it, right? So in that particular situation, what exactly do you do to put that human element in the entire story?
Sure. And in B2B, this is a real challenge. Payoneer, we're pretty lucky on that front because we have really passionate customers, and we have millions of customers, so we normally can find somebody. But one of my previous companies, or the company I worked with immediately before Payoneer, was a hedge fund technology consulting firm. And hedge funds treat their consultants as an industry secret, or a trade secret, I should say. And so we could not get our customers to even admit they worked with us and be willing to offer a testimonial. So I totally understand the challenge. But what I think is important is to remember that you don't need your customer to tell the story for you. It's great. It lends credibility, but it's not necessary. And if you can't tell that, if you feel you need to get details about that customer in order to tell their story, I always suggest that you generalize. And so an example I give is, we work with a lot of banks, and it's tricky on a legal perspective about when we can mention them, when we can't mention them. But there's lots of stories that benefit from me explaining how we helped this bank. So rather than saying the name of a customer that I may or may not have approval to name, I would say something like, we are working with a mid-sized bank in this region. We've been able to help them do X, Y, Z. That allows me to tell that customer story without exposing that customer or having to get their permission. And it still allows me to delve into this world of story. So anytime that you can build those positive relationships with our customers and having brand ambassadors and things like that, I think really helps to do that. That's great. But if you can't do it, find ways to tell those customer stories regardless. It's ultimately in your hand. And we do find, there are certain geographies, for example, in East Europe, have clashes between the government and freelancers about how they pay taxes and how their earnings are tracked. And so our freelancer audience in those countries they're not willing to speak to journalists, basically. They don't want to be bringing any undue attention to themselves. Okay, it's a challenge. We can't tell an individual customer story, but what we can do is we can engage our company about the general way that freelancers are growing their business in that region, and then we can tell that story, and we can talk about the data and create infographics and find the human element in that way without having to expose a customer that doesn't want to be on the national stage.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Manisha, for asking that question. I hope that gave you perspective on how to tackle the problem that you put us in the chat. I have another question, Irina, and this is quite interesting. How big or small role does a spokesperson play in the success of running a global PR campaign? And the additional part of this is it advisable to have a local spokesperson always?
So it is advisable to have a local spokesperson always, first of all. And in the description I mentioned earlier about how we enter a new country, that's another reason why we wait until we have at least a brand ambassador and a customer support person, because then one of those two becomes our spokesperson. It is possible to do PR in a region without a local spokesperson. We've done it. There have been geographies that we've entered and we just didn't have that spokesperson. They were starting in a couple of weeks or whatever. It wasn't worked out yet. And so we would take the regional spokesperson and then just translate their quote and disseminate it to journalists that way. But there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, you, as a naturally kind of nervous person, that is a whole lot of trust to put in an external agency to translate and get the message correct. I would much rather have an internal employee who speaks the language read through that quote and say, yeah, this is what we meant to say. But second of all, it limits the kind of PR you can do. You can do bylines and you can do written Q&A if you don't have a local spokesperson. You can't take an interview. You can't do a media roundtable. You can't have any live interaction with journalists. And that's a massive, that's a massive channel for how to build relationships and how to ensure future coverage. So it's possible, it's not very effective.
Understood. Thank you, Chitali, for asking that question. I hope you got that answer. Any more questions that anyone would like to answer, have Irina answer for you? You can please unmute yourself or ask in the chat. We'll take one last question.
I do see a question here that we didn't respond about blogs or books.
Yeah, got that.
So I'll give a slightly different answer probably than what you're expecting. And this comes also from the fact that I stumbled into PR like many of us did. So I actually don't follow a whole lot of PR blogs or books. If I have a question, I do some Googling, but it's not what I follow. But what I think is critical is to follow your industry's trade publications and your industry's influencers, because I think learning about how to do PR effectively is how do PR professionals work, and it's more about what is the story that my competitors are telling, what is the story that my audience is responding to, and how can I interject my company's perspective into that story. So make sure that you are following your industry's developments, and that will prepare you to know which conversations you should be entering.
Understood. Understood. I think we have one last question, and then we can just close this Q&A. How important is it to understand the media sensibilities of countries?
Critical. It's critical. So, you know, as I said, it's better to not be doing PR in a country than to be doing PR in a country that you're not prepared to do PR in. Once you damage a relationship with a journalist, that relationship is burned, and it's very difficult to build it back up, because they're humans and nobody wants to work with people they don't like, right? And the challenge is that one country's celebrated topic might be offensive to another country. And I come from the US, where everything is offensive to somebody. So you really need to be very, very aware of, you know, what journalists are going to respond to and what they won't respond to. And I've had many times that I suggested a topic and had an agency tell me, actually, I think that might be inappropriate for a journalist, or, you know, people would be offended if you reached out to them right now to talk about this. So you really need to, this is why it's so important to have a local representative and a local agency you trust. You need somebody to explain to you, not just like, this is what's in the news in Serbia today, but this is the political and cultural climate, and this is what this means for this country. And, you know, so I was talking about the topics of diversity and inclusion, which are very, very important at Payoneer, and it's one of our values. And of course, again, I'm in the US, diversity and inclusion is in the news every single day, and it's a very sensitive subject. And I was talking to our agency in Ukraine, and they said, oh, we'd love to talk about diversity. And I said, okay, but what does diversity mean to you? And they said, oh, well, women being represented in the workforce, which is great. But in Ukraine, because of the cultural makeup of the country and because of the kind of homogeny of the population, that's what diversity means. It means only gender diversity. In the US, diversity has to do with cultural diversity, background diversity, religious diversity, you know, orientation diversity, so many different things. And so you really need to, you really need to understand the media sensibilities and be keeping those in mind and tailoring your message accordingly. Otherwise, as I said, just take your time, do that research, build up that team, and then enter that country.
Sure. Thank you, Irina. I think last one was on crisis. I think you've already touched upon it. So I wouldn't want you to delve into it unless you want to speak something different on that crisis one.
All I'll say is managing a crisis across geographies and managing a crisis in a public company, it's very similar. It's all about preparation. So the second you see anything, jump onto stop using formal channels, get on that WhatsApp group with your head of legal and with your head of compliance and with whoever you need to pull into that conversation, get that answer figured out, and then distribute it as quickly as you can across geographies so that you have a unified front with how you're addressing that crisis.
Absolutely. I think we are done with the questions, and we are done with right on time, I think. Thank you so much, Irina, for being the part of this conversation and giving us your two, I would say 50 cents for us to take us and get a lot of our PR plans into the motion. And I hope the audience also loved what Irina had to share in terms of how you can prepare for a global PR program. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. And we are, for all the questions that you have and all the inquisitiveness that you have for the Wizikey platform, you can reach out to us at Sales Wizikey, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really great.
Thank you, Irina. Please take care. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.